Well, many of you may not know this interesting tidbit about your pastor. My first job out of high school was as a snowboard instructor. My first job in high school, I should say. Now, I know that most of you probably are not familiar with snow sports unless you're from up north. I certainly haven't found any ski resorts in Florida. As a kid and as a teenager, there were many reasons to enjoy mountain sports. For one thing, it was time with your friends with relative freedom from your parents as you went out and explored the mountains, especially if you were faster than your parents. And there was that seemingly universal teenage need for speed and that adrenaline rush of standing on the edge of a double black diamond run, which for those of you who don't know, it looks essentially straight up and down. And then deciding to hurl yourself off the edge and begin your descent, seeing just how fast you could go without losing control. It was a great leap of faith that sometimes went well, and sometimes it really didn't. But there were other reasons to enjoy it as well. Living down in the lowlands, in the socked-in Seattle gray, it could get a bit depressing. But the mountains, particularly at the big resorts, sat just a little bit above that lower cloud line. And many of them, including the one I worked at, the clouds would often decide to rest right in the middle of the mountains, so that as you rode up the chairlift, the heavens would suddenly break open. You would go from this disorienting fog and this dimly lit landscape to all of a sudden the brightest sunshine you've ever seen, brighter even than our beaches here, because the sun was reflecting off of all of the white everywhere. At some resorts that I skied, like Whistler Blackcomb, where the 2010 Olympics were held, you got to ride a gondola, and then you had to ride, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 chairlifts more to get to the top. You ascended 5,000 feet between the base and the top of the mountain. And that elevation gain was so much that sometimes it would be raining on the bottom and snowing up at the top. On sunny days, you would reach the top and spread out before you like a magnificent painting was this sea of clouds, 1,000, 2,000 feet below you, that wrapped around all of these jagged peaks that were reaching for the sky. Some of you might have seen similar views out the window of an airplane, or when they did panorama shots during the Olympics. One recent advertisement for the Whistler ski school showed a number of kids and their instructor all with their backs to the camera, and they were facing out over one of these incredible vistas. The caption read, "What no classroom can teach." We hear about mountains a lot in the story of Moses. Now, they're not the Whistler Blackcomb kind of mountains. They're the mountains of the wilderness of Sinai and the plains of the Moab desert. Mountains where Moses goes to meet God. They're the mountains where Moses receives the 10 Commandments about the best ways to live. And in our story today, they're the place where Moses goes to die. And though they're not the rugged, jagged peaks of the Pacific Northwest, what they have to teach Moses and to teach us is something very similar to Whistler Mountain. Something that can't be learned in a classroom. A mystical encounter that can only be experienced. We heard last week how Moses met God on a mountaintop when God was thoroughly fed up with the people, and the people were thoroughly fed up with God. They're kind of like a family on a long road trip. And we heard how Moses risked his life to once again be able to see the face of the God, well, to see God, who he had once known face to face. We heard how the earth trembled when God came through. Mountains along Moses' journey, as with the mountains in many of our biblical stories and the mountains that many of us have visited, are places of encounter and awe. They're places of clarity and perspective, of pleading and compassion, of hope and promise. In Moses' journey, these mountaintop experiences stand in stark contrast to the confused and moaning, lost and despairing, impatient and despondent times down in the desert with the people. Remember what I had us do during that Child and Us All time? Carolyn and Jean very graciously helped. Mountaintop vision is that far-sighted vision. It's Carolyn this morning. It's vision where we can see clearly, where we can gain perspective, where we're not navel-gazing, but we're looking ahead toward what's coming, where we can see where we're going. The thing with mountains, though, is that you can see so much more than you will ever be able to reach or visit. And sometimes, even when you can see where you want to go, it can be hard to figure out the steps to take to get there. Because to get there, you have to start heading down the mountain, and then there's the trees and rocks. I've always been a little troubled with the story of Moses, especially the way it ends. He is described as unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt. And our passage tells us, never since has there arisen a prophet like Moses, whom God knew face to face. And this was written before Jesus and before some of what we know, but here is this man who seemed to have incredible favor with God. And yet the end of his life comes, and the place that God promised still looms out there on the horizon. He doesn't get to reach or experience the gift God promised. In fact, his gravestone is left unmarked out there in that wilderness that they've been wandering in for years and years. It leaves sort of an unsettled feeling in my stomach. Kind of the way when a book or a movie ends abruptly without reaching resolution or the place where you thought it was going. And it raises all sorts of questions for me. The book of Numbers tells us that the reason God doesn't allow Moses to reach the promised land is because when the Israelites were complaining in the desert about not having water and whether God was big enough to care for them, Moses didn't stand up for God. Moses didn't defend God's holiness. But we all make mistakes. And the God that Jesus tells us about is not one that punishes us cruelly for one mistake, but one of infinite grace and mercy. So why doesn't Moses reach the promised land? And if Moses isn't good enough to reach that land of promise, what does that say for all of us? And why in heaven's name does God taunt Moses by showing him a vision of this promised land? As if to say, you can look, but you can't touch. I've thought about that a lot this week. I've thought about what would I say to our congregation today on this last Sunday of our series, Responding to God's Gifts, when the story I've been given to preach is about a promised gift that is never received. Do I preach? Yeah, sorry. God does take backs on gifts sometimes if you make a little mistake. Do I preach? Yeah, I'm sorry. God will show you good and wonderful things, but God will never let you have them. Sometimes I think that's how some of us can feel in our faith journeys. Well, I went back and I reread those lines about Moses. Unequaled for all the signs and wonders the Lord had sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. You see, when I first read this, I felt indignant that Moses didn't reach the promised land. Because if anyone had earned it, if anyone had deserved it, it was Moses. But so often throughout the Bible, God doesn't give merit-based gifts. Sometimes God gives need-based gifts. But often they are simply freely given at God's pleasure. So with that in mind, I read those lines a different way this time. Moses didn't make it to the promised land, no. But Moses received incredible gifts from God. I mean, who else gets to know God face to face? Who else gets to go from a tongue-tied murderer to a great leader and liberator of people? Brother David Steindl-Rast, who I mentioned in my very first sermon during this series, talks about how the greatest gift we receive is this present moment. He says if we didn't have this present moment, we wouldn't have any opportunity to do anything or experience anything. He says it's a given moment, as we often say. Yesterday, Rich Feigl and Sarah Butts and Karen Lederer and I all went to the Florida Conference United Church of Christ biannual meeting. The theme for our gathering was Standing on the Threshold. And we certainly were. As a conference, we voted in the new conference minister, John Bergen, and we said goodbye to our regional conference minister here in the western region of Florida, Sarah Lund. But a threshold isn't just something we stand on when there are big leadership changes or big personal life changes. Thresholds with wide vistas ahead of us and wide vistas behind us are where we stand in every moment of every day. Every moment presents us with an opportunity to look up and look out and head into something new. For Moses and the Hebrew people, they looked to God at first because God was useful. God was a means to an end. A means to their liberation from Egypt, a means to getting to this land of milk and honey, a means for food and water and security out there in the desert. What the people had to learn was that God's presence was in and of itself a gift. No matter where they were, no matter what their context, no matter how easy or how hard things got. And what Moses had to learn was that being called to participate in leading people in the way of God's promise and love and justice, that participating in that was a gift in and of itself. I had the privilege of hearing a chaplain, a friend of mine, preach on this text several years ago when I was in seminary. She reminded us that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his last speech, entitled it, "I have been to the mountaintop." The day before he was assassinated, he said, "Like anybody, I would love to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And God allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And the next day, he was assassinated. All throughout the Bible, creation is described as being pulled by a promise. It's a promise that gives us with a future as a part of God's kingdom, but it is also a promise that gives us with something today, right now, in this present moment. Because God is here with us right now, even as we are on our way. Catching a vision of the promises God has for us gives us a dream, like it did for Martin Luther King Jr. I wonder what you would see if you stood and looked out over the terrain of your life, where you have been and where you're going. What promises would you see in store for you? What promises would you see beckoning you forward? And I wonder what you would see if you stood on a mountaintop and looked out over God's promises for Good Samaritan Church, for Pinellas County, for our world. What vision of promises are we catching? God took Moses to the top of that mountain because God's promises for his people were bigger than he could see from down below. It couldn't be taught in the classroom. It was so big. Do we dare to dream bigger than what we can see inside these walls? Do we dare to seize the gift of this moment, the opportunity to meet God right here, along our way to promise? Do we dare to thank God for the opportunity simply to participate in leading this world and its people towards the good promises of God? God's promises for us are so big that there will always be more promise ahead long after we are gone. But what a privilege and what a joy and